I know, Rockefeller, I can eat them raw.
I know,
Whatever you want.
do.
Let's get some oysters going.
Yeah.
Galveston Bay Foundation is a conservation nonprofit that preserves and enhances Galveston Bay.
Yeah, and one of the ways they do is partnering with restaurants from Houston to the Gulf Coast, collecting their shucked oyster shells. Joining us to share more is Bob Stokes, president of the Galveston Bay Foundation. Good morning,
Good
Bob.
morning.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I love oysters, and I'm just starting to learn about this because it's about 10 years that you've been doing this to really help give back and help out the environment. Explain the process of taking the shucked oyster shells from the restaurants.
Yeah, exactly. So about 10 years ago, a little bit over 10 years now, we were approached by one restaurateur who said, hey, we have all this oyster shell. We're serving a lot of oysters on a half shell to our customers. We're taking that oyster shell, throwing it in the trash, and it's going to a landfill. Can you help us do something with it? And we said, absolutely. We can collect that shell. We collect it now from 31 different restaurants. We collect over 300 tons of shell a year at this point in time. We take all that shell, we essentially have to cure it for a while before we put it back in the bay, but ultimately we take all the shell and put it back in the bay to serve as new homes for baby oysters.
That's one of the things that fascinates me. You pick up an old shell out of the water and it's like, well, here's a half shell with no oyster in it, just the half shell, and you flip it over and there's a little nub, maybe the size of your fingertip, and you say, that's a new oyster that's growing on a used shell.
Exactly, and so that's how oyster reefs grow, right? The oysters grow on top of each other, and so the reef builds and builds. But we don't have enough oyster shell out in Galveston Bay. At least we have way less than we did historically. So it's important to take what we call a substrate, the hard surface of an oyster shell, put it back in the bay so those baby oysters can start growing on it. So they're already growing on some of our existing reefs, but we sort of help the process along by bringing a lot more shell and putting it into the bay.
Can you make up for lost time in that sense?
There's a lot of oysters have struggled, recently in Texas for a lot of reasons, starting way back in 2008 with Hurricane Ike, which created a lot of damage to our oyster reefs, put a lot of sediment and mud on top of the reefs and really smothered a whole bunch. We've had a lot of drought and flood, and oysters really don't like those things. Mm-hmm. So yes, we are sort of working our best to restore the things that have been lost in Galveston Bay. We're fortunate to still have live oysters in Galveston Bay, and we're just trying to make sure that we still have live oysters in Galveston Bay 50 years from now.
Yeah, and we just saw a video of them putting these kind of bags full. Explain how it's built and how it kind of stays there in place.
Yeah, so we put oyster shell back in the bay in a number of different ways. Like we do like massive dumps of like tons and tons of oyster shell onto a reef itself, or we do it with individuals who we help them. They actually help us. They put those oyster shells in bags at certain times of the year. They hang them from their dock, and there's little baby oysters that are floating around. They're called spat. They're microscopic. They're just looking for an oyster shell to latch onto and grow into a new oyster. And they latch onto those oyster shells, and it sort of fast forwards the process. And so we call those people oyster gardeners.
Okay.
And they're really.
And anybody can get involved in that
anybody
sense.
with a dock basically. And we tell them that they're actually fostering the oysters because they have to give them back. They can't keep the baby oysters because we then put those oysters back in a reef in Galveston Bay.
That curing process is important, right? You can't just, it's not like I can eat an oyster and throw the shell back in and it's going to do the same thing as what you're doing.
Yeah, well, it's really because we collect shell from Gulf Coast oysters, we collect from East Coast oysters, West Coast oysters, and so Texas Parks and Wildlife Department wants to make sure we're not introducing any invasive species from anywhere else. And so we literally have to bake that shell in the sun for 6 months, turn it over a couple times before they'll let us put it back in the bay, which is a smart rule, and we're glad to comply by it. But it's basically just making sure we're not introducing something in Galveston Bay that shouldn't be there.
Shouldn't be there,
Yeah,
right?
and Bob, talk about the importance of being able to do this, because we talked about, possibly helping with erosion and just helping the environment.
Yeah, so oyster reefs are super important for lots of reasons. One adult oyster can filter 50 gallons of water a day. And so it's really important for water quality. And I think maybe you're a fisherman, I can't remember, but there's a lot of fishermen in our area.
Yes.
The best places to go out in Galveston Bay are around the oyster reefs because the reefs provide home for these little small fish. When the small fish are there, the big fish come and eat those small fish, and then the fishermen come and catch the fish. But yes, Sophia, we can use oyster reefs as shoreline protection. We actually build some oyster reefs specifically to protect shoreline from erosion. And so there's so many reasons to really care about having a healthy oyster reef population in Galveston Bay. They provide so many benefits, sort of a building block of all the things in Galveston Bay.
Even if you don't love oysters individually, there's a,
Even
there's
if you
a
don't love the
big
raw
reason for
ones.
it, right? Where can folks get involved, or if they want to donate or find out more? Is there a website?
Yeah, well, so we have our website of our organization, the Galveston Bay Foundation. It's galvbay.org, galvbay.org. But I would also go to your local restaurant the next time you order oysters and say, hey, where are these shells going? And hopefully the waiter will say, we're going to recycle these shells and put them back in Galveston Bay.
You know?
And if it doesn't, if that person doesn't say that, ask them why not they get involved with the Galveston Bay Foundation.
Put you guys together.
Exactly.
It's a question I always ask now.
Great.
Ever since Zach did that story.
Right.
Every
Super.
food festival, everywhere. What are you doing with those shells?
Just raising
Right.
awareness, because it's all about a healthy Galveston Bay.
That's great.
All right, Bob. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.